At exactly 9:10 p.m. on November 9th, seismologists monitoring the Pacific noticed something that made their blood run cold. The storm approaching the Philippines wasn't just massive, it was 1,800 kilometers wide, making it one of the largest typhoons ever recorded. But size wasn't what terrified them. It was the timing. Buried in classified disaster response reports, scientists had just uncovered evidence of something unprecedented. The Philippines was experiencing the world's first documented compound disaster cascade. One magnitude 6.9 earthquake had weakened infrastructure. Typhoon Fung-Wong had overwhelmed rescue systems. Now Fung-Wong was arriving to finish what nature had started. Emergency planners call this a black swan event, until now. Because the data shows this is not random. Earth's most violent forces are beginning to synchronize their strikes. So when the next cascade begins, will your country's disaster systems survive what the Philippines couldn't? The Philippines sits at the convergence of three major tectonic plates: Pacific, Eurasian, and Indo-Australian, making it Earth's most disaster-prone nation. This geographic curse means the archipelago endures an average of 20 typhoons annually, alongside frequent earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. In 2025 alone, the nation faced 21 named storms, pushing even their extraordinary disaster tolerance to a breaking point. But nothing prepared them for the mathematical precision of what was about to unfold. Three catastrophes would strike with surgical timing, each exploiting vulnerabilities created by the previous disaster. It began with what seemed like an isolated tragedy, but it would prove to be the first domino in a cascade that rewrote disaster science. September the 30th, 2025, 9:59 p.m. local time. The Earth convulsed beneath northern Cebu with a violence that had not been felt in over a century. The magnitude 6.9 earthquake struck just 10 kilometers below the surface, shallow enough to transfer maximum destructive energy directly into populated areas. Within seconds, the tremor had killed 79 people and injured 1,271. But these numbers masked the true devastation beginning to unfold. The Bogo Bay Fault, dormant for over 400 years, had awakened with apocalyptic force. Surface ruptures stretched 35 kilometers beneath the Camotes Sea, while the ground itself moved in what seismologists call right lateral motion, a grinding, tearing movement that shattered foundations across northern Cebu. In Bogo City alone, over 100 sinkholes appeared overnight, swallowing roads, homes, and any chance of rapid recovery. Dr. Maria Santos of the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology later testified that this was not just an earthquake, it was systematic infrastructure assassination. Every bridge crack, every weakened foundation, every damaged power line became a vulnerability, waiting to be exploited by the next disaster. The statistics painted a picture of calculated destruction. 159,361 houses were damaged. 7,701 were completely destroyed. 16.23 billion pesos in infrastructure losses. But buried in these numbers was a more sinister reality. The earthquake had not just damaged buildings, it had compromised the very skeleton of disaster response. 27 power stations failed. The Cebu Negros Panay electrical grid fractured. Emergency communication systems went dark across 309 municipalities. As aftershocks continued, 12,704 were recorded in total, with 46 strong enough to be felt. Something else was stirring in the Western Pacific. Typhoon Fung-Wong was gathering strength, and it had chosen a target already on its knees. November 4th, 2025. While Cebu's residents were still digging through earthquake rubble, Typhoon Fung-Wong made its first of 8 landfalls across the Visayas region. The storm did not arrive as a single catastrophic blow, but as a methodical destroyer, striking Samar, then Masbate, then returning to savage areas still reeling from the earthquake. What made Kalmegi uniquely devastating was not its Category 4 winds or 5-meter storm surges, it was its timing. Emergency response teams that should have been available for typhoon deployment were still conducting earthquake search and rescue. Hospitals damaged by seismic activity now faced flooding. Roads cracked by the earthquake became death traps as Kalmegi's torrential rains turned fissures into chasms. The cascade effect manifested with mathematical precision. In northern Cebu, families who had evacuated damaged homes after the earthquake found their temporary shelters obliterated by Kalmegi. The National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council reported 232 dead from the typhoon, but this number failed to capture those who died not from wind or water, but from the compound effect of disasters striking in sequence. "We watched our disaster response system experience a heart attack," said Bernardo Rafaelito Alejandro IV, Deputy Administrator of the Office of Civil Defense. "Every resource was already deployed, every emergency shelter was full, every rescue boat was in use. When Kalmegi struck, we had nothing left to send." But nature was not finished. While the Philippines struggled to respond to two simultaneous catastrophes, meteorologists tracking the Pacific noticed an anomaly that defied their worst-case scenarios. Typhoon Fung-Wong was not just forming, it was exploding into existence. On November the 3rd, 300 nautical miles northeast of Chuuk, what began as Tropical Depression 23W underwent what meteorologists call explosive intensification, gaining 47 miles per hour in just 24 hours. Fed by sea surface temperatures of 29 to 30 degrees Celsius, Fung-Wong did not follow normal storm development patterns. It grew geometrically, reaching a diameter of 1,800 kilometers, while maintaining super typhoon intensity across its entire massive structure. The Philippine Atmospheric, Geophysical and Astronomical Services Administration issued an unprecedented warning, naming the storm Uwan before it entered Philippine waters, only the second time in history such action was taken. The reason was simple. Fung-Wong was approaching as more than a storm. It was approaching as the final blow in a cascade designed to overwhelm any disaster response system on Earth. When Fung-Wong made landfall at Aurora Province on November 9th at 9:10 p.m, it struck a nation already broken by compound disasters. The super typhoon had 185 miles per hour sustained winds and 230 miles per hour gusts, which would have been devastating under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. This was systematic annihilation. The numbers tell a story of cascading horror. 1.4 million people were displaced by Fung-Wong alone, but these were people who had already been displaced by the earthquake, and then by Kalmegi. Emergency shelters designed for 30-day temporary housing were now accommodating their third wave of refugees in 6 weeks. Rescue teams exhausted from earthquake response and Kalmegi operations faced a third catastrophe with no reserves, no rest, and no hope of adequate response. What killed was not just wind or water or seismic shock, it was the compound effect. Buildings weakened by the earthquake and damaged by Kalmegi collapsed under Fung-Wong's assault. The Bunton Bridge, which had survived both previous disasters, finally succumbed to 12-meter flood levels, the first closure in its history. Power systems jury-rigged after the earthquake and temporarily restored after Kalmegi failed catastrophically, plunging entire provinces into darkness that would last weeks. The international community watched in horror as the cascade effects created something disaster scientists had theorized but never witnessed: systematic infrastructure deletion. Each disaster did not just cause damage, it eliminated the ability to respond to the next disaster. It was Darwinian selection applied to catastrophe, survival of the most brutal. Dr. James Chen of the Disaster Systems Research Institute analysed the real-time data with growing alarm. He said, "We watched each disaster systematically eliminate the country's ability to respond to the next one. The earthquake broke the infrastructure. Kalmegi overwhelmed the response. Fung-Wong finished what nature had started." This was not three separate events, this was one coordinated assault. The cascade mechanism operated with terrifying efficiency. Power systems needed intact roads for repair crews, but roads were flooded. Hospitals needed electricity for life support, but power grids were destroyed. Evacuation required functional bridges, but bridges had been weakened, flooded, then obliterated in sequence. Each system's failure amplified the next, creating what engineers call a failure cascade, where the collapse of one element guarantees the collapse of others. Communication infrastructure provided the starkest example. Cell towers damaged by earthquake were temporarily repaired, only to be flooded by Kalmegi, then completely destroyed by Fung-Wong. As each communication node failed, emergency coordination became impossible. Rescue teams arrived at locations already served, while other areas received no help at all. The Philippine Disaster Response System, once considered the gold standard for typhoon-prone nations, did not just fail. It collapsed into chaos. The human cost transcended statistics. Communities that had survived centuries of typhoons through collective action found their social fabric shredded by sequential trauma. The traditional Filipino bayanihan spirit, where neighbours help rebuild after disasters, broke under the weight of 3 catastrophes in 40 days. How do you help your neighbour rebuild when your own home has been destroyed 3 times? How do you maintain hope when each recovery attempt is obliterated by the next disaster? Dr. Eleanor Rodriguez of the Systems Vulnerability Institute identified the phenomenon. She said that each disaster did not just cause damage, it systematically eliminated defences against the next disaster. This is not about bigger storms or stronger earthquakes, this is about timing. When disasters learn to coordinate their strikes, traditional disaster planning becomes obsolete. The global implications sent shockwaves through emergency management communities worldwide. If the Philippines, with 5 decades of typhoon experience and world-class disaster protocols, could suffer systematic collapse from cascading disasters, what hope did less prepared nations have? The pattern was not unique to the Philippines. Climate scientists identified similar vulnerability chains across the globe. Caribbean islands face hurricane-earthquake combinations. California confronts wildfire mudslide sequences. Japan deals with earthquake, tsunami, nuclear cascade potential. Each region has its own cascade signature, but the underlying mathematics remain constant. When disasters strike faster than recovery systems can respond, collapse becomes inevitable. The economic devastation extended far beyond the immediate 18 billion pesos damage estimate. Luzon, responsible for 70% of Philippine industrial capacity, went offline. Manufacturing ground to a halt. Supply chains serving all of Southeast Asia were severed. The economic heart of a nation of 115 million people stopped beating, and the effects rippled across the global economy. Vietnam, already dealing with its own typhoon damage, saw 2,800 additional homes destroyed as Fung-Wong's influence spread. Taiwan evacuated 8,500 people. The cascading disasters were not respecting national boundaries, they were revealing the interconnected vulnerability of the entire Pacific Rim. The Philippines had become an involuntary laboratory, demonstrating a new form of catastrophe that existing disaster models could not compute. Traditional planning assumes what disaster scientists call return to baseline, meaning after each event systems recover to original capacity. But cascade disasters create what researchers now term baseline erosion, where each disaster permanently reduces the capacity to respond to the next one. The International Federation of Red Cross had to revise its emergency appeal from $8 million to $18 million overnight, but even this massive increase proved inadequate against the cascade effect. How do you budget for disasters that multiply each other's impact? How do you prepare for catastrophes that hunt in packs? The timing coincided with COP30 climate meetings in Brazil, creating a bitter irony. While world leaders debated carbon credits and emission targets, the Philippines was burning through its disaster resilience reserves at a rate that made all climate planning seem tragically inadequate. As November progressed, weather satellites showed more storms forming across the Pacific. The cascade had not ended, it had merely paused. Super Typhoon Fung-Wong was followed by more systems, each finding a nation progressively less capable of response. The Philippines faced what disaster planners had thought impossible: negative resilience, where each disaster leaves you weaker than before, creating a downward spiral from which recovery becomes mathematically impossible. The new reality demands a complete reimagining of disaster preparedness. Dr. Rodriguez explained, "We have been preparing for bigger disasters. We need to prepare for coordinated disasters. When Earth's forces learn to attack in sequence, traditional disaster planning does not just fail, it becomes part of the vulnerability. Infrastructure interdependence, once seen as efficiency, revealed itself as cascade vulnerability. Modern cities operate on interconnected networks, where each system depends on others. Power grids need transportation networks for fuel delivery. Hospitals need power grids for life support. Transportation needs communication for coordination. Communication needs power for operation. When disasters strike these interconnections in sequence, the entire web collapses." The Philippines proved that cascade disasters do not need to be larger or stronger, they just need timing. A moderate earthquake, followed by a regular typhoon, followed by another typhoon, creates more devastation than any single massive catastrophe. It's not about the size of the hammer, it's about hitting the same spot repeatedly before it can heal. Climate change isn't just creating stronger storms or more frequent earthquakes, it is decreasing the intervals between disasters and creating overlap where none existed before. The Western Pacific's typhoon patterns show clear acceleration, with major storms arriving faster than historical patterns. When reconstruction takes 18 months, but storms arrive every week, the mathematics lead to only one conclusion: permanent catastrophe. The Philippines survived its triple disaster, barely. Emergency systems designed for sequential events faced simultaneous catastrophes and collapsed. Communities accustomed to rapid rebuilding faced repeated destruction and surrendered. A nation that had mastered the art of disaster recovery discovered that mastery means nothing when disasters refuse to follow the rules. But the cascade pattern identified in the Philippines is not unique, it is spreading. Similar compound disaster signatures appear in climate models worldwide. The Mediterranean faces heat, drought, and wildfire cascades. The Americas confront hurricane, flood, and disease sequences. Asia battles typhoon, earthquake, and tsunami combinations. Each region has its own cascade DNA, but the outcome remains constant when disasters synchronize, civilizations' defenses crumble. The terrifying truth is that the Philippines was not experiencing a freak occurrence. They were experiencing the new normal. In a warming world where extreme events multiply and intervals shrink, cascade disasters transform from possibility to probability to inevitability. The question is not whether your nation will face its own triple disaster. The question is whether your disaster systems can evolve faster than Earth's forces are learning to coordinate their attacks. Because in our interconnected world, when disasters learn to cascade, nowhere is safe. The Philippines did not just survive 3 disasters in 40 days, they survived a preview of everyone's future, A future where catastrophe comes not as single events, but as coordinated assaults designed to overwhelm any defense humanity can mount. And the Philippines, they were just the practice round. The next cascade is already forming, choosing its target and timing its strikes. When Earth's most violent forces synchronize their assault on your nation, will your emergency systems fare better than the Philippines, or will you discover, as they did, that we have entered an era where disasters do not queue politely for their turn? They attack in packs, and they are learning to hunt more efficiently with each cascade. Subscribe to Earth Attacks for critical updates on cascade disasters reshaping our world. When catastrophes learn to coordinate, knowledge becomes survival.